All right, thank you very much for coming to my talk today, and thank you to the Boston chapter of the Ministry of Testing for inviting me. I am very excited to talk with you about getting organized for Postman testing success. So I thought I would start with a little bit about me, just so that you know who is talking to you. So I was originally a music teacher, and I did that until about 2008. And then between 2007 and 2008, I was a professional organizer. And then in 2009, I discovered my passion for software testing, and I have never looked back. So I've made a little Venn diagram here of my passions, and you can see that today's presentation is basically the confluence of everything that I care about: software testing, teaching people things, and organizing things. So before we go on, I want to ask, because I'd like to know who my audience is, I'd like to find out if you are currently using Postman. If you are using Postman, just say yes in the chat, please. If you are using some other kind of API testing tool like Ready API or something like that, you could put what that is in the chat. And if you have never used Postman at all, never used API testing, put in no. So I'll know basically where we are. Yeah, Danny's used it a little bit, yeah. Okay, just a couple of no's, mostly yeses. Okay, good to know. So for those who are new to Postman, it is a tool for building and testing APIs. It comes in free, pro, and enterprise versions. It's extremely easy to use. It uses the Chai expect assertion library, so you can assert on all kinds of interesting things. You can run requests from the command line using a tool called Newman, and you can also create documentation and mocking with the tool. And here is just a brief little tour of what Postman looks like. We're going to start right here in the middle with the familiar stuff. This is where you actually make your HTTP request. So you can see we've got our HTTP verb. We've got our request URL. Here's the body of our request. Here's the response body that we get in return, and here's our response code. So those things should probably look pretty familiar to everyone. Then we have some other fun things, which is what we will be diving into today. We've got our requests, which we can save. We have folders and subfolders, which help us organize our requests. We have collections, which are groups of folders. And we have workspaces, which are groups of collections. And I will be talking about each of these things in more detail as we go on. And finally, we also have environments. Those are collections of variables, which you can use when you're working with a collection. So we're going to start with the organizational elements, and I just want to mention that if you have questions at any time while I am talking, you can feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm sort of monitoring the chat, so I will address them as we go. And then there will also be a couple places where I'll pause and ask for questions as well. So let's start with workspaces. So workspaces are like a desktop for your work. It allows you to divide your work logically. You can have personal workspaces and you can have team workspaces. And the team workspaces is for the pro version and above. And basically what you can do there is you can have a workspace that you share with your entire team. You can put collections in there. Everyone in your team can see them. Your team can contribute to them and so on, which is very helpful. So some organizational tips for workspaces. First of all, each team in your company should have its own workspace. That makes it very easy for people to divide things up, and then each team to have their own sense of ownership over their stuff. Keep everything you need for an application in one workspace. For instance, if you have an API, let's say, we'll call it like employee API. You don't want half of your requests for employee API to be in one workspace and the other half in another, because that's going to be really frustrating when you have to switch back and forth between workspaces. Share only necessary things with your team. This is so you don't get all so the workspace doesn't get all jumbled up with all of your stuff. If you have some testing that you want to do, like on a Jira story or something like that, that probably nobody else needs to see, you can keep that in your personal workspace, and that keeps your team workspace uncluttered. And then finally, give only 1 or 2 people admin rights to the workspace. Lots of people can contribute to the workspace if they've got a collection that they would like to share, but make sure that not everybody can edit those things without having some kind of a version control, which Postman also does. Because otherwise you might wind up finding that someone is changing your requests and then none of them work anymore. So it's just helpful to have only 1 or 2 people be able to make those changes. So let's go on to collections. So collections are the top level folders that hold saved requests. And this is my favorite part about Postman, because collections can have folders and subfolders and sub-subfolders and so on, so that you can organize your requests however you want. So here I have an example of some collections right here. So I've got 3 different APIs, and so each one of my APIs is a different collection. So here are some organizational tips for collections. Name your collection after your API. That makes it really easy to remember what you called it. Use a naming convention with standard spacing and capitalization. That just makes it easier to find things. And then your collections will be alphabetized, but if there's a collection that you use all the time that you really want to be able to grab quickly, you can use this little star to favorite your collection, and then that way it will always be at the top. Okay, let's move on to folders. So as I mentioned, folders can have subfolders, sub-subfolders, sub-sub-subfolders. I actually one time decided just for fun to see how deep I could go, and I finally gave up at 10 subfolders. I think I probably could have gone farther, but it's really fun the way they nest. Then they're easy to open and close so that you can see all your requests. All you have to do is just click on the little caret next to the folder, and everything inside that folder will open up so you can see it. So here's an example of, this is my file post-processing folder. And within my folder, I've got some subfolders. I've got a folder with requests for content length checking, a folder for virus scanning, a folder for video encoding. So here are some organizational tips for folders. Follow a pattern when you choose what should go in a folder. And what I mean by that is, and we'll get into this a little bit later when I talk about some organizational patterns, but you don't want to have a folder that's, oh, let's do all happy requests here in this folder, and then this other folder is going to be just requests for this endpoint. So try to be systematic. Think about it as if you were actually like filing papers. You want it to make sense. Give your folders easy to read names. That's so that you can find them quickly. Stick to naming and capitalization conventions. I'm going to keep on reiterating that because it makes it so much easier to scan through and find what you want when you have a lot of requests. And then finally, keep everything in a folder. This is because if you have one request that you've saved, like let's say I've saved one request in my video encoding folder, but it's not in a subfolder, it's going to wind up down here underneath all of the other subfolders, and then I'm going to forget about it. I'm going to not remember why it's there. So I like to keep everything in a folder so that everything's easy to find. So let's talk about requests. So requests can be happy path or sad path. So happy path would be a request where you're getting a 200 level response. So let's say you were requesting a particular list of resources, so that was a get, or maybe you're doing a post to add a new resource. So those are your happy path requests. Sad path requests are the ones where you want to make sure that things get handled correctly if the user doesn't do what you expect. Like if you're doing a post to add a new employee, let's say, and the employee is missing a first name. So then you're going to get a 400 response, and you will definitely want to be asserting on those kinds of things so that the user will have a good experience if they make a mistake. And it's important to have requests for each endpoint, because if you don't have requests for each endpoint with assertions, then you might be missing something if there's a regression. I actually found, this was a few months ago, I actually found out that we had a security hole in one of our applications, and I thought, well, how is this possible? We have a nightly security test that we run on our API where we are checking all of our different endpoints to make sure that they're all secured properly, and it turned out there was an endpoint we didn't know about. So that's very important, to have requests for each endpoint. Here are some organizational tips for requests. Don't include the HTTP verb in the title of the request because it's already there. So when I first started working with Postman and I was doing a lot of getting, get this employee, get that employee, I finally realized that when I was naming the request that we've got this nice green get word right there. So it doesn't really make any sense for me to have a get in the title as well. It's just redundant and it's just using up space that I could be using for a better title. Give your requests descriptive names so that other people can use them too. Make sure that other people understand what those names, what those requests are doing. Don't make the names too long. The reason why is because then it'll bleed over the edge of your folder and then you won't be able to see what the rest of it is unless you click on it, which wastes time. Stick to naming and capitalization conventions again. And finally, this was one of my teammates came up with this, that pipes are an effective way to organize names. So here I have with these 5 requests, basically what we're doing is we're asking each time for a list of employees, and it could be employees in a single company or it could be employees in a multi-company, which is like a group of companies. And we could be asking for the list as an admin, so using the admin token, or we could be using an employee token, or we could be using a terminated user token. And so basically what this is doing is it's showing, what are we asking for? Okay, we're going to ask for the multi-company employees, and who are we asking as? And finally, what is it that we're trying to get? We're trying to get the employee list. Okay, let's move on to assertions. So there are 5 main assertion types that we use in Postman. There are status code assertions. That's like, you want your response code to be 200, so let's assert on that. There's a response time. Did I say status code? Yeah, status code assertion, response to have status 200. Then response time assertions, that's where you want your response time to be below a certain level. So this particular test right here is asking that to check to see if the response time is below 2 seconds. There are header assertions, where you check to see if your headers coming back are correct. There are response body assertions, and that's just asserting on something within the response body, some kind of text. So right here I have response contains first name, and I'm just checking that whole response body to see if the words first name are in there. And then finally, there are JSON value assertions, which are my favorite, and that's where you're actually asserting on a specific JSON value. So you can see here, I'm expecting the JSON data first name to equal Amy. So where to put assertions? So I was very, very excited when I attended PostCon last fall, and I discovered that you can put assertions at the collection level and at the folder level, which I had no idea about. So it's really, really helpful to put assertions at a level where they can be shared, because then if you ever need to make a change, you don't have to change it in a whole bunch of places. So here are some suggestions of where to put assertions at the collection level. So any assertion that will be the same throughout the collection. So examples of that might be like a header assertion. So let's say that you have a specific security header that your company needs to have returned with every API response. So you could assert on that at the collection level, and then just every single request that gets run in the collection will automatically assert that that header is there. Same thing with response time assertions. Let's say that you have a service level agreement where you always want to have an API response within 3 seconds. So you want that to run on every single request you made, so you're going to put that at the collection level. Then there are folder level assertions. So those are for any assertion that will be the same throughout the folder. Some examples might be response code assertions. Like let's say you have a folder that's all happy path requests, so you're going to get a 200 for the whole thing. You could do that assertion right there. Something else you can do, which is nice, is if you just want to assert on 200 level responses, so maybe some of your responses might be 200s, some might be 202s, there's actually an assertion that you can do that will say, I want my response code to be within this selection. So I want it to be 200 or 202. And then there's body assertions. If there's something that you want to come back in the body of your response with every single request you're making at the folder level, then you could put that there. And finally, the request level, which is most commonly used, and that's any assertion that's going to be unique to that request. So response code assertions might be unique in a folder if you've got both happy and sad path requests. Body assertions, JSON data assertions could also go here. So here are some organizational tips for assertions. First of all, think about what you are really trying to assert and don't feel like you have to assert on everything. I think sometimes people, when they start working with APIs and they get a big amount of data in the body of the response, they kind of feel like they have to assert on every single thing in the response, but that's not really necessary if that's not what your test is for. So for example, if you had a test where you wanted to, let's say, change an employee's email address, and so you did a request to change the email address and then did a request to fetch that email address, did a get, then, well, if you fetched, so you did the get on the employee and you got all of the employee details back, you don't need to assert, oh, well, is this the right first name? Is this the right phone number? You only need to assert on that email. So that makes your test simpler and more easy to maintain. Put the assertion at the highest level you can, meaning, is it the request level? Is it the folder level? Is it the collection level? Give your assertions names that make sense. And here are some examples on the right. So a good assertion name is status code is 200. So you're making a request, you want to make sure you get a 200 back. A less descriptive assertion name is status code. Well, what does that mean? I don't know what the status code is just by looking at the name. If that test fails and I see my status code test fails, well, like why? What was I expecting? What did I get instead? If you're using status code as 200 and it fails, you know you didn't get a 200 back. Another example of a good assertion name is correct first name is returned. You know what you're looking for. You want to get the first name back and you want to make sure it's correct. Correct record is returned is not as good because you don't really know what you're asserting on there. It could be anything in the record. Another good assertion name, missing last name error message is returned. So you can tell this is a sad path request. You're going to want to get an error message, and the error message that you're expecting is that you are missing the last name in your request. So error message is not a good assertion name because you have no idea what the error is supposed to be or what the message is supposed to be. Okay, let's move on to environments. Environments are groups of variables and values. They are great for testing in different environments such as dev, QA, or prod. So for example, if you have, and here on the right I've got a picture, we've got dev, prod, QA, and stage. All of the requests that you're making in your collection are all the same. The only things that change might be things like the URL that you're hitting to access that environment, or an ID that you are using for that particular environment, or maybe like a username and password that you need to get a token or something like that. So what you do is you save all of those variables in an environment group. And then when you are running your tests, all you have to do is just use the drop-down, choose which environment you want, and then you're all ready to go. You don't have to do any kind of cutting and pasting. It's all just ready to go. Environments are also great for storing data to be retrieved in a later request. For example, if you need a token to make all of your other requests, you can have your first request in your test collection be to retrieve that token, and then you can save that token as a variable, and it will save in your environment for you, and then it will be ready to use and to reference for the rest of your requests. So, organizational tips for environments. Keep your environment names short. The reason why is because the particular box, the drop-down that you use to choose your environments, is kind of narrow, and it's hard to see what your environment is if it's too long. So if we look here on the right, which API with really, really long name is the prod environment? Well, we can't tell, because what it is API with really, really long name dash prod, or API with really, really long name dash QA, but you don't see that here. And even if you choose one of these, and it's up here at the top showing which one you've chosen, you still can't see because it's still cut off. So definitely keep those environment names short. Put the environment, meaning the test environment, in the name with capital letters. I just like to do this because it's really easy to find things that way. So I might have employee API dash dev in capital letters, or employee API dash prod in capital letters. And that way I don't make any mistakes and I'm not testing in the wrong environment at a crucial moment. And again, keep your naming conventions consistent. Okay, moving on to variables. Variables can be used in many places, which is really fun. They can be used in URLs, they can be used in headers, they can be used in the body of a request, and they can be used in assertions. It is very important to note that variables are case sensitive. This tripped me up when I first started using Postman, because I was saying to myself, why is it not sending in the company ID? I've got the company ID variable right here. I can see it in my environment. Well, it was because in my environment, it was lowercase c, and in my assertion, it was uppercase C. Here are some organizational tips for variables. Give your variables descriptive names, not user1, because you will go back to this API for testing after a couple months of not using it, and you will have no idea what user1 means. User with credentials is way more descriptive. And although I have been saying throughout this presentation that you should make your names short, this is a case where you don't want to make your names short, because if you abbreviate the words in your variable names, you're going to forget how you abbreviated them. And this was something that tripped me up as well. So I had initially in my variables, I was using co-ID, C-O capital I-D, for the company ID in my variable. And then a little later on, I thought, oh, well, it must be C-O-M-P capital I-D. Well, no, that wasn't it. And then I couldn't remember what I had used. So if you just decide you're going to write out the word company and then ID, it's just easier to remember. And again, decide on that capitalization pattern and stick to it, because those variables are going to be case sensitive. So in the next slide, I have a little exercise for you. It's going to be using the RESTful Booker API, which some of you may have used before. It's just a fun API to use to pretend to make hotel bookings and retrieve hotel bookings and change them. And I'm going to have two pictures, two screenshots, one of a list of all of the requests that I'm going to be making in my collection, my folder, my subfolders for the RESTful Booker API. On the left-hand side, it's going to be very organized, following all of my rules. And on the right-hand side, it is going to be disorganized, not following my rules. And so my task for you is, when I go to the next slide, you're going to look for the request where somebody is updating a booking and they are missing a required field. So I'm going to click now. And oh, sorry, booking not found. That's what it is, booking not found. So take a look at RESTful Booker on the left and find that booking not found put request. and then look for it on the right. So when we look on the left, it's pretty easy because first of all, we can see we've got our happy path requests, we've got our negative requests with that that consistent capitalization. And then here, we've got booking not found, booking not found, booking not found. That's really easy to find. And we've got our put right there, so we can find it very, very quickly. If we go over to the right and we look at the badly organized RESTful booker, well, where's our put? Well, oh, I see right here in lowercase letters, there's our negative folder right here. And well, I know it's a put request, so it could be this one, but I'm not really sure because whoever saved this one decided to just save the URL as the title. So I don't know what this is. And I mean, moreover, I can't even get to the end of it to see what it is. So you can see, comparing the left to the right, how much easier it is to find the requests that you need. And when you have scenarios where you want to share requests with other people, or you want to do quick regressions, it's just so much easier to be able to find things quickly. Okay, before we go on to our 4 organizational patterns, I'm going to pause here in case anyone has any questions. You can put the questions in the group chat. Okay, I'll just give it a few more seconds. How do you version tests? Oh, that is a very good question. Versioning is not something that we're particularly using at my company. The way that we're using Postman is we're running all of our Postman requests in Newman. So we have all of our Postman collections and environments are in source control. They're just in Git. And so if we make any changes to any tests, we will do a pull request and have someone approve it and merge it in that way. There are some really fun new features that Postman has where you can actually do versioning directly in Postman itself. So if you are interested in that, I would definitely recommend checking that out. And we've got a comment. Much of this is good advice generally, not just for Postman. Absolutely, yes. And as I mentioned, I used to be a professional organizer, so I apply this kind of advice to everything I do. Do you have to use Pro version? No, you do not. There are so many features that are available just in the free version. You can do things like make collections, make workspaces, you know, all the folders, subfolders, all of those things, running your collections through Newman from the command line, all of that is completely free. Is it possible to use parameterization in our tests using Postman? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. Do you want to elaborate? Yes, using variables. Yeah, well, and you can also, yes, you can absolutely, yes, use one request with different data. There are some people at my company who have to run through a whole lot of data, and so basically what they're doing is they're uploading that data on a spreadsheet or comma separated value sheet, and then Postman can just run through all of those requests, and they'll just substitute each of the variable values as they go through, which is really cool. Okay, any other questions before we go on? Okay, so let's talk about 4 different organizational patterns. So these are just patterns that I came up with when I thought about different ways to organize Postman collections. Some of which I've used, some of which I've not, and I'm sure that there are more organizational patterns than these, but these are the 4 that I came up with. So yeah, how to import the Excel sheet with different data to use as a valuable for value. Yep. So that's in the collection runner, which is part of Postman. It's part of the free version. So it's really, really easy to use. I'll direct you to the documentation and you can check it out there. So, okay, so first organizational pattern, happy path, sad path. So this is good for smaller APIs, and you can basically just organize it sort of like the one that I just showed you in our exercise, where we had a happy path with all of our basic endpoint tests, and then we have the sad path with all of the negative tests. So 2 different folders, happy and sad. And then if you have things organized in this way, the happy path folder can be used as a quick regression check. So if you've got a developer who says to you, hey, you know, I just refactored some of my code, can you just check and make sure that all of our endpoints are still working correctly? You can just run that basic endpoint test folder, whip through it really, really quickly. Sad path folder is good for validation checking. If you want to make sure that all of the different values, like here I've got it as an example, if you are adding a new contact, all of the different ways that adding the contact could go wrong, so I have one request for each. So the next organizational pattern I have is endpoint. So basically in this one, you've just got one folder for each endpoint in your API. This would be good for larger APIs that have lots of endpoints. And then if you want to, you can actually do the first pattern, happy path, sad path, as sort of a subfolder section of your collection. So here's an example. The contact list API, we've got a get contact list request, which is getting the whole list. And then we've got a get contact request, which is just getting one contact. We've got the add contact request, the update contact request, and the delete contact request. And here in the add contact folder, you can see I've got these 2 subfolders that are happy path, where I'm adding in only things that will work correctly, and then I've got the negative requests, so what happens if somebody forgets to put in the first name, last name, whatever. And then you can do those happy path negative request subfolders in any one of your upper folders for each endpoint. Okay, and now the user stories organizational pattern. I haven't actually used this one. But this is something I made up. It's good for customer workflows. And you can have a folder for each workflow and then have subfolders for different scenarios. So if you imagine that you have an online bookstore and you think about what are the different kinds of things that your customers might want to do when interacting with your online bookstore, you can make a folder for each of those things. So folder for create new account, for update an account, for searching for a product, for making a purchase, for requesting a product return. And then in each of those folders, you could have subfolders for different workflows or different outcomes for those workflows. So here's make a purchase. So there's a few different scenarios in that. So the customer might complete the purchase, or they could change their mind and cancel the purchase, or they could update their cart right before they do their purchase. So we've got a subfolder for each one of these. And then the last pattern I have here is the validation type pattern. So this is good for APIs that require a lot of validation. So for example, if you've got a post that you're making, let's say you're adding an employee and the employee has all kinds of data, you'll want to be validating on each of those different bits of data. You know, is the first name too long? Is the first name missing? Did somebody send in a integer for the first name or whatever? So you can have folders for things like missing data, character limit violations, invalid characters, invalid data types. So what I have over here is I've organized them by different types of validation. So here's header validations. So inside that I've got, well, what if it's missing the content type header? What if it's missing the auth token? JSON body validations, and then I've got subfolders for that. Well, missing a field, or invalid field type, or too many characters. And then I've got URL validations, such as what if my sort parameter is invalid, or my query string parameter is invalid. This is also really good for security testing, and we do this on my team because for every endpoint, I mean, practically every endpoint that we have requires some kind of authentication token, and it often also requires an API key. So we have just a whole series of tests about if we call this endpoint, what happens if it's missing the token? What happens if the token's wrong? What happens if it's missing the API key? What happens if the API key is wrong? And we just burn right through them in a nightly test, and we can get through them very, very quickly. So that's really helpful to make sure that we don't open up any security holes with our development. So before I open it up for final questions, I'm going to skip ahead to my thank you. Just a few plugs here. If you enjoyed my talk today, you might also enjoy taking my Postman course, which is a LinkedIn learning course called Postman Essential Training. Basically what it teaches you is how to do some of these things we talked about today, making collections with assertions, both positive and negative, running that collection in Newman, and then finally setting it up to run in Jenkins. And then you can also connect with me. I have a weekly blog called The Thinking Tester. I publish a new article every Saturday. And then you can find me on LinkedIn and on Twitter and on Instagram. So thank you very much. And now I will open it up for more questions.